forgot my manners and I forgot to observe all protocol and acknowledge the presence of my mother and grandmother in the audience. Thanks for joining us. So we'll move right along. You're not here to see me. Up next is the panel Murder, She Wrote, and it's two local ladies, Charlotte Otter and Margaret from Kempler, and facilitated by Olivier Morellon. I was just getting a little French pronunciation lesson, but I don't know if I did it very well. Please welcome them to the stage.
Welcome back to the second half of tonight's panel discussions. With me for the second part, Margaret van Klemperer and Charlotte Otter. Before we'll jump into the discussion, I would like to say a few words about both up-and-coming crime novelists. So sitting on the far end is Charlotte Otter. She's a journalist by training and started out as a trainee reporter at the KZN Witness and then the Star. Later, she worked as a crime reporter at The Citizen before she went into corporate communication. In 1996, she relocated to Germany, where she still lives with her husband and 3 children. She works as a corporate communicator in the IT industry. Balthasar's Gift is her debut novel. It was published in German in 2013 by Ariadne, a Hamburg publisher that focuses on crime fiction by women, as Balthasar's Vermächtnis, and last year in South Africa by Mujaji. Balthasar's Gift, set in Charlotte's hometown Pietermaritzburg, circles around the crime reporter Margaret Klute, who one morning is sent out to cover the shooting of the HIV activist Balthasar Meyring. When Margaret continues to investigate into the murder against her editor's wishes, she soon finds herself entangled in more trouble than she can wish for. Also with me is Margaret van Klemperer. Margaret was the arts editor and journalist for KZN Witness for 16 years and decided then to give up her long-time job at The Witness to fully dedicate herself to fiction writing. But she still remains a book reviewer for the newspaper. Born in Britain, Margaret has been living in Maritzburg together with her husband for more than 40 years, and they have 2 adult children. Margaret's debut novel, Just a Dead Man, was published by Jacana 2012. It is also set in Maritzburg and follows the story of the artist, teacher, and divorcee Laura Mash, whose life is nothing outside the ordinary. That is, until her Zimbabwean friend Daniel Moyo finds a dead body in the plantations around the house. Daniel soon becomes the prime suspect in the case and is arrested. Eager, or maybe perhaps over-eager to help her friend, Laura starts her own investigation into the murder case in a, what I would maybe call a Miss Marple-like manner. So welcome to the both of you. Murder you wrote and still write. Why crime fiction as the genre to tell your stories? Charlotte, if we maybe start with you.
Yeah, so actually crime fiction chose me. The first draft of Balthasar's Gift was in fact literary fiction. I wrote my way into the story, and it was only when the first draft was completed and I was driving home from Berlin. It was late at night, the rain was lashing down, my 3 kids and my husband were sleeping in the car, and I had not exactly a vision, but a very strong feeling that the story needed to be crime fiction. That was the way I had to tell it, and the protagonist had to be a journalist. So, as I said, the crime fiction aspect chose me, but now that I'm writing crime fiction, I find it's a very exciting genre, and it's certainly a superb way to tell the kind of stories that I want to tell.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose I started with crime fiction because I've always enjoyed reading it as escapist fiction in a way, but it also is a very valid insight into any society. Although this is being referred to as crime fiction, it's more in the older tradition of the whodunit. rather than the sort of white-knuckle ride. I think the older I get, the less I want to be frightened by what I'm reading. And I just want to explore how ordinary people cope with finding themselves in an extraordinary situation. And I felt that crime fiction would be the way to do that. And so, why we both set our murders in Maritzburg? I mean, Maritzburg's obviously the murder capital of Natal.
Well, we'll get to Maritzburg a bit later. Margaret, you've just mentioned that you've always liked reading crime fiction. So which fictional detectives inspired your protagonist or protagonists? And to what extent do you follow your, let's say, role model or break away from the traditional detective figure in your novel?
I wouldn't say anyone really inspired what I've done. The ones I've really enjoyed reading have always been the detective novelists whose books have been funny. I like humour. I feel it's a genre that needs to be entertaining. I suppose the one I've really admired over the years is the British writer who's now died, Reginald Hill, who wrote the D.L. and Pascoe series, which was televised. But even funnier than those, he had a black private eye detective in the town of Luton, which is sort of about 40 miles out of London. Those books are incredibly funny, but they are detective stories. And local writers, I've always enjoyed Sarah Lotz's crime fiction, which again is very funny. It's referring back, I think, again to a slightly older tradition of the sort of the wisecracking detectives. Which that's the sort of writing I've always admired. I wouldn't say I've managed to do that, but that's where I sort of feel myself coming from.
Charlotte, what about you?
Yeah, so my formative detectives were Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, closely followed by Charlie's Angels. But as a grown-up, very much the Scandinavian crime writers, and particularly the Stieg Larsson trilogy, which, as a former journalist, I completely gobbled up and found to be fascinating. But I tend to agree with Margaret that I've also enjoyed crime fiction where there is a frisson of humor, and I think it's important. I also think it's hard to do because you're dealing often with very serious topics, and it is something I attempted to do in Balthazar's Gift, was to bring an aspect of humor into the novel. I think Maggie breaks with perhaps my formative detectives in that she's kind of a detective by mistake. She doesn't intend to be, and she gets sucked into a story that is kind of unavoidable.
I have to say that Stieg Larsson definitely did the trick for my dad. It got him in front of the TV for, I think it was the 24th and the 25th of December one year. So I can definitely relate to that. Both Just a Dead Man and Balthazar's Gift, respectively, are your debut novels. How was it to jump into the world of writing fiction?
Well, it was always a goal for me. I was an obsessive reader as a child. I loved English at school. I devoured every book in our house. In those days, there was no such thing as YA. So basically, I finished Narnia and moved straight on to Jane Austen. The family story goes that I read Jude the Obscure at 11, but I don't actually remember that. So I think a huge love of fiction. And throughout the week, that's what I've heard from all the writers that I've been on panels with, is that every single one of the writers are obsessive readers. And I think when you love stories so much, you carry a burning desire to write one. It just took me a long time to get going. And I started writing Balthazar's Gift when I was 39, kind of as a form of a midlife crisis. I thought if I don't do it now, I'm never going to do it. I'm going to die old and bitter, and I'm going to blame my family. So to avoid that, I started writing at 39. And I did dive into it, and it did become an obsession. And I wrote 14 drafts of the book because I was determined that I could, if this was going to be my only book, which I hope it won't be, it would be the best possible book that I could write at the time.
I think 39 sounds very young. I wouldn't say I jumped into it. It's been a case of a very slow, gentle immersion. I started writing my first novel when I was 14. It only ever had 3 chapters because I did discover at 14 that although I had a very handsome hero, I didn't really know what people did apart from being handsome, so I stopped. And it took me a very long time to actually produce an entire book. I found it a difficult move. Again, like Charlotte, I've read a lot, but I found a difficult move from having been a journalist, which is a very different kind of writing. I found the move into fiction quite difficult. When I decided to stop being a journalist, it took me quite a long time to find the voice I needed to produce a book. But as I say, Charlotte at 39 has got a longer career ahead of her than I have, I think.
Margaret, you've just mentioned that it was difficult for you to get away or to change from writing journalistically to writing fiction. You have been an arts editor and a book reviewer for the KZN Witness, and you, Charlotte, started out as a journalist and work now in IT communication. How have your professional backgrounds influenced your fiction writing?
I think journalism teaches you a lot of things, including how to write to a deadline, which we were actually talking at supper among the writers. It's important to actually get there. You have to sit down and write. It's no use thinking about it, talking about it. You've got to do it. That's something journalism teaches you. It doesn't teach you to foreground your own opinions. It teaches you to actually put them into the background. So that was a difficult move into fiction. And the first book that I tried to write after I retired, and I sent it off to a publisher and it was rejected, and they said, you've got to find your own voice, which is why this is actually written in the first person, because I thought that would be a way to do that. It's difficult to come from a journalistic background into fiction writing, I think. So that was difficult, but because I was writing all the time, the actual aspects of writing, I mean, I can write English. I don't have a problem with the actual writing because I've been writing for a long time. So there it was helpful. It's getting that voice. It's getting out of being the background to the story and foregrounding yourself. That was hard. But I think generally being a journalist probably was a plus rather than a minus.
Yeah, actually being a journalist has helped me in my corporate career as well in terms of being obsessive about deadlines. And I am to this day. For me, I was only a journalist for a very short time. I mean, I've always earned my living by writing, but I ruthlessly plundered my short experience in newsrooms for the subject matter for the novel. I had to dig quite deep because it was quite a long time ago, so I stopped working in a newsroom in '93. So I had to dig quite deep into the memory banks to try and remember what it was like. But I certainly used it as material.
To then go with it.
Yeah.
Charlotte, you've mentioned 14 drafts, and I've read about it on your blog and elsewhere online. Maybe then the next question to you first. How much research and planning went into Balthazar's Gift, and how did you go about crafting both plot and characters?
As I said, I wrote my way into the novel, so I didn't really know where I was going. I knew there was a dead guy. I had a vague idea that he might be an AIDS activist. I had his mother, and I had his boss, who's Lindiwe Dlamini, the head of the NGO. And it took me a long time to work out what the story really was about. So I am what writers call a bit of a pantser, in that I write by the seat of my pants. However, with my second novel, I've had to indicate to publishers that I am able to plot. So I'm working to a 2-page plot plan, which I'm largely ignoring. Interestingly, the 14 drafts, so the match from my first draft to this is the dead guy, 2 sentences and a metaphor, which really shows, and this is another thing the writers have been saying this week, how hard it is. How hard it is. It's easy to write a first draft. How hard it is to write a book that works, that sets out a promise at the beginning of the story and meets that promise at the end of the story. And how I did it was I made sure I got a lot of support. So in the early months, my supporters just had to be cheerleaders. They weren't allowed to criticize. Their job was only to say, you're wonderful, and your book is wonderful, and they weren't allowed to give any criticism. And then later down the line, I tried to find readers who were somehow tied up with the publishing industry so I could get really critical, useful feedback that I could plow back into the novel. And I remember around draft 3, a friend of mine who's a talent scout in London, a very, very superb reader and she has an amazing taste. And she said to me, well, I managed to get about a third of the way through the book, and you've made a terrible mistake writing it in the first person. You've got to change it to the third person. And I cried for 3 days, and then I did what she told me to do. So I've always tried to listen to the people that I deem to be wise, and I try to put their feedback into the novel. And I feel very lucky that I was able to access a couple of people like my friend to help me, improve it and make it the best possible book it could be.
Margaret, did you have similar experiences, or
No,
how do you go about it?
Well, to deal with the research first, there wasn't an awful lot of research I had to do, really. The historical research into the sinking of the SS Mendi comes into that. And there I had to do some research, and that was also quite interesting, also titanium mining down the wild coast. But all that research was relatively straightforward to do. And the legal research that I needed to do, because obviously the guy gets arrested and he got out of the cells, was very easy because I'm married to a lawyer and my daughter's a lawyer. So if I needed any legal advice, I just had to sort of ask the armchair next door. And so I didn't have to go anywhere for that. That was very straightforward. Plot and character. I find the plotting incredibly difficult. I find the characters much easier to draw. I started with an idea. I was actually out walking my dogs, and they rushed off, very much like in the book. They rushed off and started barking at a bush. And I went to see what they were doing, and I thought, what if there's a dead body under that bush? There wasn't, fortunately. But as I was walking them back, and I thought, actually there's an idea for a story in there. Somebody walks their dogs, they find a corpse. So I had that much of a plot, but obviously I had to develop it from there. The characters, once I developed them, they actually took the story along. And I got about 2/3 of the way through the book, I suppose, and I thought, this is actually getting a bit flat. I think I need another corpse. So I had to kill off one of my characters who I really liked, but I needed somebody else to be dead so that we could sort of have a bit more excitement. So the plotting I find very difficult. I admire writers who have the whole thing laid out in sort of a card index and they know exactly what the next scene is going to be. But I can't work like that. My characters develop as I go along and they take the plot with them. And new characters came in who I hadn't thought of at all in the beginning. So, to me, characterization is a lot easier than plotting, which probably I shouldn't be writing crime fiction where plot is actually important, because I find the plotting unbelievably difficult.
Well, then, lucky you, because my next question actually deals rather with character than with plot. Let's have a look at your protagonist, and we have prepared or discussed about a little paragraph that Margaret is now going to read. The protagonist is at a lawyer's office asking for help to bail out the main the Daniel Moyo, the friend, and that's where we are.
Okay. The I in the book is Laura. She's the main character. I asked if I could see Daniel, and he said he would try to take me down to the cells to talk to him tomorrow morning. I then began to explain that I wanted to talk to the murdered man's son, the one who had identified the body. He must know something. I mean, did his father have enemies? Apart from seeing Daniel, had he come up from Durban for anything else? I stopped. Robin was looking at me with an expression of alarm. Laura, the man was murdered. Keep out of it. This is not a place to play amateur detective. The police are investigating, and so am I. We'll look at all this, don't worry, but don't get involved. Anyway, you could be a witness. What? What was I a witness to? It was my dog that found the body, but that's all. He shook his head at me, but nevertheless handed over a phone number for Paul Nzoia, the dead man's son. Inspector Pillay had told him Nzoia wanted to see the place where his father's body had been found. So if he came to look, maybe I could speak to him. But for God's sake, be sensible, he said firmly.
Thank you. So Laura doesn't strike me as a person who listens to what people tell her to do. What's Laura like, and how would you explain her drive to start her own investigation into that murder case?
I think she's a very ordinary person. She's sort of every woman. I mean, she's a single mother, she's a teacher, she's divorced, she has problems with her ex-husband and his new wife, but she has a deep sense of justice, and she sees Daniel's arrest as being a huge injustice. She doesn't trust the police. She thinks they've picked him up simply because he's a Zimbabwean refugee. He had a connection with the body, he found it, therefore it's easy to arrest him. He's the guy they've got to go for. They're looking for a quick resolution to a murder. She actually comes to fancy the police inspector quite significantly. So that does complicate her relationship with the police later on. But she's driven by this sense of justice. Somebody has got to do something. She cannot let this man just be locked up because he happened to be there. She shoots from the hip. You know, she doesn't take advice. She does her own thing. And I think the fact that she shoots from the hip and opens her big mouth, probably in that way she resembles her creator to some extent. But she really is just an ordinary woman caught up in an extraordinary situation. And she just feels she has to do something. And I think that is actually quite an ordinary reaction. I think a lot of people would do the same.
Let's maybe move on to Maggie and to you, Charlotte. Similar situation, no, not similar situation, not at all. Maggie is waiting for one of her contacts, and the little paragraph that Charlotte is reading sets in right before that.
Balthazar's words rang in her head as she opened the chicken's throttle up Old Howick Road. Someone with humanity, someone who cares for the victims. That level of involvement had got her into trouble at work more than once. Both Patel and his predecessor, a lugubrious Zimbabwean called Bert Townsend, had warned her to back down. "Geez, Maggie," Bert would say, scraping his comb-over back into place with the nicotine-yellowed fingers. "The verb is report. You are a reporter. It's not your job to get in there and get your hands dirty." She resolved to be cool and professional, a promise she made frequently to herself and to her editors. Still, as she rocked the chicken onto her stand on the grass outside the gates of the park and walked in, her heart was racing.
Thank you. So again, Maggie doesn't like to listen. She goes and meets that contact of hers. How would you describe Maggie, and what makes her the successful reporter she is?
Yeah, I don't actually know if she's that successful. Because she is headstrong, follows her own path and not necessarily the path that her news editors would like her to follow. She is stubborn, she's hard drinking, she likes a bit of sex, she does her own thing, she's an outsider, she's an Afrikaner in an English newsroom, and she also doesn't have a university degree, so she's somebody who just worked her way into the newsroom from kind of the photocopying room. So very much an outsider. And I think why I found the character of a journalist useful for crime fiction is that journalists always have this dichotomy or this dilemma of, are you an observer, and at what point do you become a participant? And we heard very fascinatingly from our colleague Mazili Kaziwa Africa last night about that particular dichotomy, and I think it's something that we've definitely seen over the years in South Africa, is at what point do you stop reporting and at what point do you get involved? And that's what I loved about Maggie, is that she has no filters. She threw herself into the story, and that made her a really, really fun character to write. Also, she's the journalist I was too scared to be. So she was kind of like an alter ego for me.
Now I would like to get back to Maritzburg. Both your novels are set in and around Maritzburg. How important is the city as a place in your writing?
Yeah, so for me, I left Maritzburg when I was 18. I went to UCT, then to Joburg, then to Germany. So it's very much the place of childhood memories. Also, when you live away, when you don't live in your home, the physical characteristics and qualities of your home, the sensory qualities, the smells, the sounds, the feelings, the heat, the cold, are very alive. So it was not only the setting of Maritzburg that I used, but the physical and sensory memories I have from childhood. And somebody said to me, with your first novel, don't hold back, throw everything at it. And that is what I did in terms of setting up Maritzburg as the setting. Maritzburg is also very interesting from a historical point of view. It's always been a battleground, Boer and British. I grew up in the 80s. There were wars happening in and around the townships of Pietermaritzburg. So to me, it seemed like a fascinating, small example of larger South African history. So to me, a very useful place to set a very South African story.
Margaret?
I set the book in Maritzburg because I actually enjoy reading books that are set in a place I know. And I mean, I know Maritzburg, and I've had quite a lot of feedback from local readers who've enjoyed the fact they recognize places. Obviously, it's not a map. I mean, it's not a topographical dissertation. And if there's a house or a tree in the wrong place for what I'm writing about, then I just knock it down. It's fine, it's gone. But I think people enjoy a sense of place in a novel. Also, because Maritzburg is not a big town, you can show the sort of peculiarities of South African society. I mean, there's one time when Laura's walking and she meets the police inspector who she quite fancies, and he has run across from what is traditionally the Indian part of town towards where she's walking up from, which is traditionally the white part of town. And you can draw all these little strands together. It's not an important part of the book, but it's just there as part of the background. And because I know the town, I can visualize exactly where they are. Okay, I put roads in where there probably weren't any and this sort of thing. I don't think Maritzburg's particularly murderous. I think it's quite by chance that we've both killed off large sections of the population in the last few years. But I think the thing is you write somewhere that you know, and it can root your book in a sort of reality. And obviously people who don't live in Maritzburg can still read the book and it really doesn't matter. But people who know the area, then I think it does say something.
Actually, interestingly, when I was launching the book in Pietermaritzburg last year, I did a session of trying to sell the book at Exclusive Books. They gave me a table and a pile of books. And I said to one guy, it's Father's Day, you want to buy someone a nice book for Father's Day? And he said, actually, there was a murder down my street, so I don't want to read crime fiction. And that actually brought it home to me that what is sometimes imagination for us as writers is very much people's harsh reality.
Moving away a bit from your books, Margie Orford is frequently referred to as the queen of South African fiction and seen as influenced by feminist inscription. To what extent do you align yourself with Orford's work and or differ from it? And also, where do you position yourself within the wider field of South African fiction?
So I made sure not to read any of Margie's work while I was writing Balthazar's Gift. So I was highly aware of her and her success and her wonderful novels, but I made sure not to read any of her books because I didn't want to, in fact, very little South African literature while I was writing, so not Margaret's book either, because I didn't want to be influenced in any way. I totally align myself with Margie, however. I've since read her books and they're fantastic, and I align myself in terms of her feminist project, and that's very much something that I'm trying to do when I'm writing as well. In terms of placing myself, like Maggie, I'm a bit of an outsider. It's very hard for me to objectively say where I fit into this particular world. But I'm thrilled and excited to be part of it. And I think the explosion of fiction in South Africa since 1994 has been absolutely stunning to observe from the outside. And I thought I knew all the writers until I got here this week, and I'm taking notes of all the books I need to order and read when I get home, because when I'm out there in Germany, people tend to regard me as the expert in South African fiction and need to make sure I know everybody's work. So I'm grateful to Margie for what she did. I think she cracked the door open for us. But I think there's an enormous explosion happening way beyond Cape Town and Johannesburg.
I mean, I know Margie and I like Margie and I love her writing, but I think I'm coming from a rather different tradition. I'm writing quite different sort of books. So when I had a launch in Cape Town, actually Margie interviewed me at the launch and we had great fun. But I'm coming more, as I said before, from the strand of whodunits rather than the sort of crime fiction that Margie's writing. This feminist thing, I actually worry about this. I don't consider myself a feminist writer. I don't consider myself a woman writer. I consider myself a writer. And I feel quite strongly that writing is one space where men and women are, well, not competing, but we're on a completely level playing field. And I don't want to be pigeonholed into being a woman writer or a feminist writer. I worry terribly about, there's a big literary prize in Britain, it used to be the Orange Prize and it's now changed its name, which is for women's writing. Now, if someone set up a literary prize for men's writing, there would be a huge outcry. And I think it's very reductive to actually say we're giving a prize for women's writing. Women can compete for any other literary prize, and I've always had serious reservations about the Orange Prize. It's just been won by some fantastic writers. But I don't like this sort of, because you're a woman and you have a woman protagonist, you have to be seen as a feminist writer. And I don't actually think it's fair. I mean, everybody writes about the things that concern them, and in my writing I'm sure there are strands of feminism in which I believe quite strongly, but I would never consider foregrounding it as part of my writing.
I, on the other hand, do. I fully embrace being a feminist and a female writer, and it's important to me because I believe that women's voices have been marginalized. I believe that women's voices have been left out, and I think that it's important that they're heard. And one of my projects in this book and continuing in other books is to not only give voice to Maggie, but to give voice to marginalized women. So those of you who've read the book will know that somebody who's extremely marginalized actually helps Maggie in the final act of catching the killer. And maybe it's a little bit, I'm dreaming of a world, a paradisical world where women are absolutely equal to men. You know, in my forthcoming book, I have women in senior positions at the newspaper. But I think that's okay. I think that's okay to dream of a better world. And I think it's okay to dream of a world where women's voices are heard. And I think, you know, that is something I will continue to do.
Charlotte, you've mentioned, I mean, the amount of literature that is out there, South African literature in general, but also considering the spike in crime novels in recent years in South Africa, it is clear that crime fiction is one of the most vibrant genres within the South African literary scene. Why do you think this is so?
I think crime fiction, I think there are two main reasons. I think crime fiction, popular fiction in general, but crime fiction, can hold a really good mirror up to society. You can bring in all kinds of things, xenophobia, racism, but you're not writing a sort of didactic tract about it, but you can show it in a very accessible way. So I think that is one of the reasons why it has taken off so much, that the concerns that society feels can be very much part of what you're writing, but still very accessible to the general public. And the other thing that I think probably has played into the spike in crime writing is obviously South Africa is a society where there's a lot of crime. And crime fiction, now here I think you've got to draw a distinction. There's been a move recently into this sort of dystopian fiction which doesn't do this, but crime fiction will normally give you a resolution, the sort of Sherlock Holmes happy ending, whereas a typical Sherlock Holmes story will start in Baker Street, where they're sitting around playing the violin and injecting cocaine and having a cozy time. Then somebody will come in, there's a crisis, they go out of Baker Street, they go into the fog, they go into London, they go into danger. They resolve the situation, and then they come back, and they're back again in the sitting room in Baker Street. And crime writing has done that since those days. I mean, that's a long time ago. But it comes to an end, the baddie is usually caught, and so the reader feels a sense of comfort, which I don't think you necessarily feel in society, where there is a lot of crime, a lot of which remains unsolved. So I think that's played into the popularity of crime writing. As I say, this recent move into sort of dystopian fiction, which doesn't have that sort of closure at the end, is something I actually wonder why this is becoming so popular. I mean, I enjoy it, but it is a change, and you wonder whether, people don't believe in the sort of happy ending anymore. But that's why I think that there's been a spike in crime fiction.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think the great thing about crime fiction is that you can read it on many levels. So somebody who knows nothing about me, nothing about South Africa, can pick up Balthasar's Vermächtnis in a German bookshop and read it purely for the entertainment value. Somebody else who might have visited South Africa and may have more of an inkling of the issues in the country can read it and learn slightly more. And a South African can read it and identify strongly. So I think that's what's very satisfying about crime fiction, is that it purely entertains, but it also offers this mirror to society and an opportunity for people to learn and grow if they choose to.
And my next question plays actually exactly to what both of you have mentioned. According to Chekhov, a writer has a responsibility to, and I quote, describe a situation so truthfully that the reader can no longer evade it, unquote. To what extent do you see yourselves as socio-political commentators through your fiction?
So I don't feel like a commentator, but I do feel very strongly that I had a burning need to tell a particular small part of South Africa's history again. And for me, that small part of South Africa's history was the period in Mbeki's presidency when he was led astray by AIDS denialists. And to me, it was a tragic period for South Africa, because people who were ill were not getting the medication that they needed. Economically active adults tragically died, leaving us with a whole generation of AIDS orphans and grannies who were suddenly coping with looking after a whole lot of children. So for me, it was less about commentary, but it was more that it was a burning story that needed to be told. I felt like it hadn't maybe been touched in South African fiction yet. I felt like it was a gap. It touched me very, very much, the plight of people who were not able to get their hands on the ARVs in order to live more healthily. And I do think crime fiction plays into that need to reflect on burning issues in society.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. I think to sort of see myself as a socio-political commentator would be perhaps an exaggeration. But I remember as a student, a question that kept on cropping up on English papers at university was, all literature is propaganda, discuss. And yes, it is. I think it has to be. You are making a point. I mean, I'm dealing with things like xenophobia, racism, the manipulation of history. And I think you can do this very easily in crime fiction, but obviously all fiction is making a point. So to that extent, yes, you're a socio-political commentator, but ultimately, you're just putting these ideas out there. This is not a sociological work. The ideas are there in the fiction. You hope the reader will pick up the fiction, enjoy the story, be carried away by the sort of the white-knuckle bits. But ultimately, they will actually pick up the issues that you've touched on. I hope not with a heavy hand, but they're there, and they're there to be absorbed by the reader. So yes, I think, I wouldn't sort of associate myself with Chekhov for the simple reason that I don't really think I'm quite in that league. But
Charlotte, and I mean indirectly also you, Margaret, you've mentioned, it was a story that you needed to tell. What other topics do you feel you still need to talk about, or you want to talk, or rather write about? Charlotte, if we start with you.
The topic of, women, very important to me, to try and posit a world where women have more of a voice and are heard and respected for their voice. The next book that's brewing has an ecological theme. I think we need to look after our planet a little bit better. So the burning issues, there are a lot to choose from, and it's really about what touches you at the time of writing.
yes, I think something that you feel strongly about will inevitably get into your fiction. The novel that I'm working on now, I've nearly finished, actually deals with exile, or at least with what it feels like. One of the characters in this book grew up in exile His parents were in exile in the struggle. He grew up in Britain and he's come back. And it's really, it's just one of the themes in the book. It's also going to be a crime novel of how people adjust to that. You know, how easy or difficult it is to adjust to living in a country where you weren't born, which is something that I've also had to deal with. So things that interest you will inevitably play into your fiction. But yes, I don't think I could ever write a book that was simply a detective story where somebody was murdered, and eventually you find out who done it. You've got to bring in the issues that, at the time, are issues that you think are important.
The dreaded last question, and you've both already hinted at it. No, not answered, actually. I wouldn't say that much. You've got to give me a bit more, or I think the audience. Is Laura Mash returning, and when?
No, she's not returning, but Adam Pillay and Tembin Nkosi Dlomo are returning. I'm working on the novel. I don't think Laura could return. I mean, she's hardly going to become a detective. You know, she just happened to get involved in one case. So, you know, and I actually, when I finished the book, I never intended to bring any of them back. But so many people have said, you know, they liked the police. Why don't I bring them back for another novel? That I think I will. That I think they will come back. But in a slightly different way. I mean, the next novel, I don't think, it won't be written in the first person. But yes, there will be the same characters, and we'll be back in Maritzburg, but there are some scenes going to be set in Cape Town, because most crime writing in South Africa seems to happen in Cape Town. So I thought I'd better give it a nod.
And Maggie Klute?
Yeah, Maggie's on her way back. She's a little bit older, so I said to my publisher in Germany, I can't write another book about a journalist who doesn't use social media. So I've brought Maggie into the present, kind of around 2012, I'm not entirely sure. She's older, she's in her 40s now. Is she still able to chase after murderers and thieves on her motorbike the way she does in book one? I'm still dealing with those issues, but Maggie is certainly on her way back.
And we're most certainly looking forward to both of them. I think we can open up the floor for questions now. Thank you very much, Charlotte and Margaret.
Thank you.
Okay, I see one hand over there.
Hi, this is for Charlotte. Just wanted to ask you, would you say your book narrated as third person when you took that crucial advice, as opposed to first person narrative, perhaps transformed your story, offering the character more emotional distance at all? And I just wanted to say as well, and how did this affect you taking that advice for the main character? Was it perhaps your concern that you felt they'd lose their energetic first person voice? I'm just interested in what was your intuitive concern, and how did it improve the narrative changing it to third person?
Yeah, so it was too close to me when I was using the I. I was conflating the I of Charlotte with the I of Maggie. My German publisher said to me further on down the line, she kept trying to force me to make Maggie be more hard-boiled, tougher. And I think in third person that was easier for me to do. It was easier for me to find the voice of Maggie in third person. In first person, I was bringing in my doubts and my concerns. You know, I would have some resistance to interviewing, you know, the family of a murdered person, but Maggie didn't have that kind of resistance. So it gave me distance from myself, writing in the third person. I got closer to Maggie, and I was able eventually, after many iterations of the book, to find her voice. And in fact, I was able to find my agent shortly after I turned the novel into third person. So I think it was a sign that it worked, that somebody in the publishing world picked it up and responded to it.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. Also a question for Charlotte from Cedric. Apologies, Margaret.
Cedric.
I couldn't help thinking when you mentioned you had the characters but not quite the plot or story. Straight away thoughts went to Luigi Pirandello's 6 characters in search of an author. And I remember your training in speech and drama at UCT, and I was wondering whether there was an influence there of being so immersed in character on stage, and perhaps did that contribute to your sort of slow start to the plot?
Cedric, no, my drama career was very short. It ended at UCT. I auditioned for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and they made me an Oompa Loompa. So I realized very early on that there was going to be no career in the stage for me. Yeah, so I think like Margaret's character was easier for me than plot. But I studied plot very thoroughly in those 5 years while I was writing Balthazar's Gift. It's amazing what you can find on the internet. And I found the people who are writing about on the internet about plot, and a fantastic woman who I still use today called the Plot Whisperer. And when I was stuck, I would, at midnight, not knowing where to go next with my plot, I would consult the Plot Whisperer and get some ideas. You know, there's some very practical ideas about craft. And that I needed to learn, and learned through my research on the internet, and then getting feedback from my readers further on down the line of what aspects of the plot worked and what aspects didn't. But I think I still struggle with plot to this day. It's a gritty one.
There's another one, yeah, there.
I'm not into crime fiction reading, but I would like to express my appreciation to the two ladies for their stance on feminism. Because of the comments that you have just passed regarding your thinking that there is a level playing field in terms of writing, and that it would be reductionist to accord prizes for women who are writing, and also the different point from you as telling that women's voices have been marginalized. It has developed an interest in me to say, I need to go and read your books and just to track how does it come through your books, the feminism part of it, in supporting it, and you thinking that it's a balanced field, so let it be as such.
Thank you.
No question, okay. There's another question up there.
Charlotte, hi. I was interested in what you said earlier when you said that you started writing it as literary fiction, and then you decided it had to become crime fiction. So what did you do differently than if it had been literary fiction? What did you think, well, I've got to use this particular convention now to make it crime fiction, not literary fiction? How do you see those differences?
Yeah, so the first draft that now lies in a drawer was written in 3 different voices. And I think, Penny, I'm not sure if you've read the book, but the voices were of Sanette, Balthazar's mother, Lynn Dewar, and a character who I later got rid of, the wife of somebody. And it just, for me, didn't mesh. It just wasn't somehow wasn't strong enough. And I think because the subject matter of HIV and AIDS in South Africa, you know, in the early 2000s is such a strong topic, I think that I needed a stronger structure. And I think that's what crime fiction gave me. And I sincerely hope to write literary fiction one day, but I think I'm kind of in the crime mode at the moment, and I think that's going to sustain me for a couple of years while I deal with these stronger and grittier topics. But I hope to one day, because I love to read literary fiction. I mean, I just read Sister Moon by Kirsten Miller. Such a beautiful book, so beautifully written, and I would love to spend some time doing that kind of writing. But I kind of have the feeling that I'm going to be on the crime pluck for the next couple of years.
If I could just jump in there. Again, I think this pigeonholing of fiction into literary fiction and crime fiction is unfortunate. There's no reason why you can't have literary crime fiction. It's, you know, just to say, because a book contains a murder, it's crime fiction. It's a pity, because, I mean, there are plenty of actually literary fiction books that have a murder, and I think it's partly done by publishers, because it's easier to sell a book and it goes on the shelf in exclusive books that says crime fiction. And it's a sort of shortcut for publishers and booksellers, but I think you don't have to separate all these things out. I think if it's fiction, and it may have a crime in it, or it may not have a crime in it, or it may or may not be literary, or romantic, or whatever it is, but it's something publishers do to you. And the problem is, once you've written crime fiction, it's quite difficult to tell your publisher that your next book won't be crime fiction, because they don't quite know what to do with you.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you very much for lovely presentations, ladies. And Mr. Mgadi, as he was speaking earlier here, he kept on saying, you see, you see. I'm learning a lot about crime fiction, not being a crime fiction writer myself, but just a writer. But I'm more interested in the metaphorical significance of corpses in crime fiction. Please discuss.
Oh, yes. I'm so glad you asked that question.
Well, if you're going to have crime fiction, you're going to actually, assuming it's murder crime fiction, you're going to have a corpse.
So for me, I have grown enraged over the years of the number of corpses that start crime fiction novels that are naked, female, and sexy. J.K. Rowling in her new incarnation as whoever does it. A lot of female crime writers do it. And personally, I find it hugely insulting and hugely disrespectful to the women who suffer abuse and murder at the hands of their intimate partners. I'm so tired of the sexy corpse. So my project is to write books that start with unsexy corpses. So far, I've killed a man. Unfortunately, it looks like in book 2 I'm killing a man too, and I'm trying very hard to deal with this because I don't want to only always kill men. But at some point, I'm going to have to have a very unsexy, clothed, unmutilated female corpse, and I'm not really ready for that yet. But I'm glad you asked the question because it really is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to move away from that particular tropey because I think it's tired. I think it's boring, and I think it's very, very disrespectful.
Yeah, I would agree with Charlotte there, but now I think about it, in my fiction, I've also only killed men, and I don't know what this says about us, actually. But the women in Maritzburg go around killing men, obviously. But yeah, you're right. I think too many crime novels, the corpse has to be female and sexy.
Yeah, and usually young.
And usually young.
Yeah.
Well, in this novel I kill off 2 men, and in the next one I kill off a man. So, and none of them are young or sexy. Well, one's relatively young, but they're...
So we'll just have to keep reading until the 2 of them finally kill a woman. All right, with that, thank you very much again. Thank you to you for coming, and good night. See you hopefully tomorrow.
Sawubona wenjabulo zusale kahle nhluphe